So welcome again. We have Ms. Gautami Shah presenting us for today, and we're very happy that we do. She is an associate professor of instruction in the Department of Asian Studies, and she's the current provost professional track faculty leadership fellow. Ms. Shah has been at UT for the past 11 years and is currently serving on ACTWEL's professional learning community. Prior to this, she started and established the Hindi programs at Yale and Rice universities and built the program at Duke University. She's been involved in a number of national projects related to less commonly taught languages, including developing national standards for Hindi pedagogy. Ms. Shah has served as the president for the National Organization of Less Commonly Taught Languages and the South Asian Language Teachers Association. Her research interests in world language pedagogy are incorporating issues of social justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion, for which she's received 2 Provost's Actions That Transform Community seed grants, resulting in the creation of a very interesting website, Inclusive Hindi. It is inclusivehindi.la.utexas.edu. She's also interested in multilingualism, translanguaging, and language pedagogy for Hindi, program and curriculum development, and innovative use of technologies in language teaching. In addition to several open educational resources projects, recognizing that the gendered nature of Hindi verb conjugations lag behind social and legal realities of the day, she has proposed a linguistically sound non-binary conjugation of Hindi verbs. And today she will share with us some aspects of inclusion exclusive to language pedagogy. So please help me welcome her to Language Matters.
Thank you so much, Betsy. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I'm just excited to be here. I just realized I might have to be here for the microphone. Give us a second. We're just figuring out one more last technology thing. Well, if you can't hear me, do let me know. Thank you everyone for being here. It's in the afternoon, it's a Thursday afternoon, and it's just before spring break. So I do appreciate everyone who's joined us. And I just wanted to convey that what we're going to have today is a conversation, nothing really new. It's things that we all have been doing for a long time. I'm just trying to put it all together because I have been thinking a lot about inclusion and world language pedagogy. And the idea of this particular presentation is to synthesize it all, put it all on one page, so we all think about it consciously. Because a lot of what we're doing is very unconscious. That's all we're doing. Some aspects that I believe, may be exclusive to world language pedagogy. Before we move on, it is important to make sure we all are on the same page when we think about inclusion. What do we mean by inclusion?
I'm seeing chat that people are having trouble hearing.
Okay, give us a second. We might have a solution to that.
Or maybe you need to move.
I can just stand here. Is it better now?
Is it better now? Yes, everyone.
Okay, then I go right
You
there.
have to move your chair over there.
Perfect. That's fine. Okay, so let us make sure that we are on the same page when we talk about pedagogy and what exactly do we mean by inclusive pedagogy. Inclusive teaching, according to the Center for Research on Learning and Teaching at University of Michigan, is deliberately cultivating a learning environment where all students are treated equitably, have equal access to learning, and feel valued and supported in their learning. Such teaching attends to social identities and seeks to change the way systemic inequities shape dynamics in teaching learning spaces. That is key because we know that these spaces actually influence the students' learning and student experiences learning. So what is the difference between that and what we have been doing for a long time? We all say in language pedagogy, we are student-centered, The difference is it's away from the traditional individualized approach. It's going more towards a holistic, approach where it's learning for everybody. In what we have been doing, what we call student center, we single out. We say, oh, we need to give more attention to these students. We need to do this for this student because there's diversity. But inclusive pedagogy is moving away from singling out to including all. And that makes a world of a difference. So that is what I mean by inclusive pedagogy, not student-centered where we are dividing the classroom into, I have to give more attention for this group, for this and the other group. Basically, the term inclusive pedagogy came from, initially from trying to figure out pedagogy for people with disabilities. And then it has spread. With that in mind, the question comes, what comes to mind when you hear the word inclusion in the context of world language pedagogy? What comes to mind? What? Tell me. Identity is one of the first things that people talk about, right? Identity. Inclusion means we have to think about identity. And why do we talk about identity? Because there is an increasing awareness of the diversity around us. And that has made us reflect on identity. And identity means inclusion. Once we start reflecting on identity, we realize there is more to identity and we have to make sure everyone feels comfortable. However, what I want to bring to our notice is, with this increasingly diverse student population in front of us, we need to make the difference, think about the difference between identity and identities. That is something we often don't do. What does it mean? What do I mean by when I say difference between identity and identity? Recognize that identity has many facets. For a long time in language pedagogy, we have been focusing on gender identity, and gender identity is really important. I'm not trying to diminish it. It's extremely important. And for me, it's extremely important. However, we overlook ethnic identity, cultural identity, social identity, socioeconomic identity, sexual orientation to some extent, and the linguistic identity. So every one of us has many different facets to our identity. It's not only one. That is something we need to be very aware of. And the intersectionality of identities, like who am I? I am a cisgender woman of color. What does that exactly say about me? Where does it place me in the power equation? That is extremely important. What about my sexual orientation? So all these different facets play together, something we're not very mindful when we think about inclusive pedagogy and the language classroom. And I'm building towards what I feel, why these are important for the 4 or 5 I have identified as exclusive to our language classroom. And important is the fluidity of identities. Not only am I a cisgender woman of color, I am different when I am working in the diaspora. I'm of South Asian origin. I'm different when I'm in my classroom. My identity has suddenly changed. The parts of my identity which are predominant in the classroom are different when I'm in a social setting, when I am with colleagues. So what identities are our students bringing to the classroom? For example, in my classroom, I teach Hindi here. In my classroom, it's very interesting when you ask students about nationality. Most of them are all American. I have a huge portion, not all, but a huge portion of South Asian origin. Interestingly, some will say I'm American, some will say I am Indian or I'm Nepali. But when you go deeper, you find out their nationality and they identify as Americans, but they feel in that space they have to say they are something because they are learning a particular language. So we have to be mindful about all these things. What identity are they projecting at what time and where? The fluidity of identity is extremely important. The focus changes. So when we realize all these things, how then can we be inclusive? As I said, we have to be extremely mindful of the language we use. We have to be mindful to remember that we are the advocates in the classroom, not the student. We do not place the burden of advocacy on the student. We start recognizing the student for who they are and try to help them feel part of it. We have to be aware of at all times, and we have to create spaces to include, which means we need to self-reflect. So understanding inclusion, after that background, understanding inclusion in the context of world language pedagogy. These are 4 aspects that I believe, and you don't have to agree with me, but I believe are unique to language pedagogy, unique to our classrooms. The target language, the language student, the multilingual student, and the subject matter. I have identified 4 aspects that are unique. Some of them have 2 sub-aspects. The target language, for example, within the target language, I think 2 things are at play. One is the linguistic features of the language we teach, and the other is the biases within the parent culture reflected in the target language. For example, we are quite now tuned to the linguistic features of the target language we teach, for example, gendered languages. In languages like French and Spanish, English for sure, people are a little more aware. Pronouns have taken center stage. We are aware that we force students to misgender if we don't let them use pronouns, which are not part of the traditional language. So that is a movement that is taking place. However, I think less commonly taught languages, and I teach less commonly taught languages, that's why my focus is on that, is still lagging behind. In many of them, the conversation hasn't started. Pronoun is not the only thing that's gendered. It depends on the language. In Hindi, pronoun is not the problem. Language, verbs are the problem, conjugations. When I say I eat or I am eating, I'm either saying it as a male or a female. That's it. I have no other option, which was always problematic because genders were always fluid. The people had all kinds of gender identities, but we didn't allow people to express themselves. Now it has become in the forefront, even for Hindi, because it's interesting that the parent culture from where Hindi comes, India, has recognized a 3rd gender legally. So on things, I have a passport form up there, and you can mark your male, female, or transgender. However, at the bottom, you see right there, maybe I can't use a cursor, but at the bottom, after you've chosen transgender, and in the center, in the middle, when you're confirming or certifying something, you're forced to do it either in a male voice or a female voice. You don't have an option. So you've claimed to be transgender. And that forces people to start thinking of being transgender as being transgender male, transgender female. There's no space for non-binary. What does one do? So, okay, I'm transgender, but I'm non-binary. Where do I fit in? So again, you're pigeonholing. So I didn't want my students to basically have to pigeonhole themselves. And I came up with what I worked on quite a while. I believe in, it might not be true, but at least the conversation has started, a linguistically sound 3rd option. So when I know a student is non-binary, they know that they have an option. It's language intervention, but language intervention has always been there. So why not now? Language intervention is nothing new. I have not invented it. So why not? Most colleagues have very much embraced it and think it's the right direction because they're faced with the same dilemma, force your students to misgender. There has been pushback, but that's fine. It's not important. What's important is the conversation has started. Even if you cannot have language intervention, you create spaces. Before I came up with this, I would tell my students, and even now they have the option, if they do not want to use something, they're told it's not part of Hindi. If you take this option and if you use it in the real world, people are going to start correcting you. And you have to tell them why you're using it. You have to explain to them. So they're aware. I'm not teaching it as Hindi, but it is an option for your identity. But if you don't want to use it, you can choose to have your entire essay in one voice, and next essay can be another voice. I have to do that. I can't let them be really fluid because then I don't know where there's error. But there are ways to create spaces. So be mindful of it, be aware of it. Interestingly, even this was a very specific case, but for okay, so that is the target, the linguistic features of the target language. The second one was biases within the parent culture reflected in the target language. Words matter, language matters. When you're teaching a text, when you're reading something, don't just go over the norms, mores, gender perception. Everything is part of it. The terms are so loaded. This is an example which one of my colleagues used at Yale University. We have the word kuara and kuari. As you see, it's kuara, a, ending for masculine, kuari, same word, e ending for feminine. The translations in the dictionary, spelling in English is off, but that's another issue, is very different. For masculine, it says bachelor, and when you go even deeper in the meaning, it just says unmarried, single, unwed, unwedded. For a feminine, it says virgin, and then the deeper meanings are pure, undefiled, chaste, single. So it's a very loaded term. Why would you reinforce that? If it comes across, you explain it. And if you need to use it, because not because you've come across, then be mindful. You could very well say not married for both. Why would you choose to use these just because it's used in the culture, in the target language? So be aware of those biases. And if you don't need to use it, don't use it. Find an alternative. If you need to use it because it's part of a text, explain it, put it in context. For Spanish, people use persona instead of hombre and mujer. Pronouns, I said, is not a problem in Hindi. However, if you look at all the books that have textbooks, how are you going to translate? So our pronoun is yah and vah, translated as he, she, it, this. He, she, it, that. However, the he, she is really not important because it is not he, she. All it means is this or that. So when I made my, grammar notes for my students, I decided to get, why should I translate it to an English pronoun, which it actually isn't. Traditionally, it was always translated as that. So anyone who translates the text, translate, he did this or she did this. This person did it, that person. Why? We have to be mindful and aware, create spaces. So no one feels that, oh, he, she. Very simple things. That was the target language. The second aspect include, and that is important. Why? Because other classrooms don't have to deal with the target language. We're the ones dealing. In a math classroom, yes, you may create space by allowing for pronouns, but after that, the target language is not important anymore. Aspects of inclusion unique to language pedagogy. The second is the language student. Language learners, this is very important to me. I've again split it in two. Language learners might be specifically vulnerable and sensitive to exclusion. You have to be aware that when a student, we all are aware, and when a student is learning a language, they're taking a huge risk. Every single day when they come into our class, it is about making mistakes. It's not about like, oh yeah, I've read this chapter, I've understood it, and I am going to now know about the history. It's about making mistakes when you talk. You might know the content, but putting it all together, expressing yourself is about making mistakes. So we have to be very, very careful about that. They're exposing themselves. Some of them are from monolingual backgrounds. They have never come across gendered languages. We think of it as errors when they're making it. But no, it's not necessarily errors. We have to be careful about that. There are idiomatic expressions, which someone who is at a higher level will get it, or a heritage language speaker might get it. But for the language learner, often it's stark, like, are they talking about wife beating? There's one idiomatic expression where in Hindi where I still don't like it. I'm not condoning it, but talking about how a husband beat the wife with a clove stick. So it's supposed to, and I don't condone it, I'm not agreeable, but it's supposed to be talking about an endearment, an enduring act. But still there is beating in it. Now, a heritage language speaker may have heard it time and again and will dismiss it as, yeah, it's nothing big because they've heard it at home. We need to bring to that heritage language speaker, maybe there's a problem, but at the same time be aware that the minute you talk about beating, even if it's a close stick, someone who's never heard the language will probably like, wow, why is this acceptable? So you have to balance that out. They're especially vulnerable. Students of mixed ethnicity are there in our classrooms. I might have a Vietnamese Indian student sitting in front of me. I have to be careful that I do not alienate the student by either thinking of that student's Vietnamese identity more or thinking of, oh yeah, because they are of Vietnamese Indian origin, they get everything that I expect culturally. You have to find that balance. So language learners might be specifically vulnerable and sensitive. Personal experiences, anything in our classroom can be a trigger. If I am teaching a class on gender inequities, okay, I know certain things will be triggers. If I'm teaching a class on ethnicity, race and ethnicity, and discrimination, I know certain things will be triggered. In our class, we have no clue what's going to be a trigger. I had a student once who they were, and we don't do this anymore. We do it, but we do it in a very different way. This was a long time ago, before I started self-reflecting. They would come and talk about family. A lot of us do that, right? And I thought I was being inclusive because I was having all kinds of, it wasn't cisgender family examples, etc. But when they present, I had all different kinds. What I didn't realize, it was a trigger for one student. So when that student came up and presented, suddenly she burst into tears and she could not continue because her dad was abusive. And I had to completely, that was out of my radar. Now it's very much on my radar. So anything can be a trigger. We think family is innocent. It's not for every student. So in our classrooms, anything can be a trigger. That's why I think the language learner is extremely important. And these situations are very specific to us. We have to be mindful if we want to make sure we are inclusive of everyone, their personal experiences. The second one I had was the heritage language student. Over time, the heritage language student became the heritage student. How often have we heard people say heritage learner and heritage student? Very often. When it first started, it was heritage language student. By doing that, we have done ourselves a huge disservice because the minute we start doing that, this is what we get. Oh, sorry. What did we have to read? 25.
Oh, sorry, I don't speak Japanese. 彼女は日本語がわかんないです。今日の電話なんですか？英語わかんない。でも今の日本語だって。でも、彼らのご注文の方は。いやいやいや、だから彼女はアメリカ人なんやね。日本語全くわかんないねん。そうだよ。お連れの方たち販売機ですかね？はい。
つまりですね、いいですか？彼女は日本人に見えるかもしれませんが、育ちはアメリカです。日本語は全く喋れません。僕らは確かに外見と言葉のギャップがあります。でも、もう21世紀、外見とアイデンティティは違うということを我々現代人が認めるべきです。そうだ、その通りだ。
So that is what we get. It's not only problematic, but it's also dangerous, outright dangerous. What we're getting into, if we remove the language from heritage language learner, we are getting into racial profiling, basically. Especially, again, may not be relevant for all language classes, but for less commonly taught languages, extremely relevant, because then we're looking at phenotypes. I teach a South Asian language, but I have students who are possibly Nepali Indian, Nepali American.
You cannot see your screen. Yeah, I think we're stuck on this video.
Oh, I haven't changed that. Oh, if you're stuck on the video.
You might be in slideshow without sharing the screen.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, I wish we had.
Technology, right?
I am sorry. Okay. Okay, then we'll play that once more so they know what we're talking about. Is that okay?
すいません。
ご注文の方お決まりですか？
Oh, sorry, I don't speak Japanese.
彼女は日本語がわかんないんですよ。今日のおすすめは何ですか？
すいません、ちょっと英語わかんないんで。でも今の日本語だったよね。
そうだよね。
彼らのご注文の方は。
いえ、だから彼女はアメリカ人なんやって。
そうそう。
日本語全く分からへんねん。
うん、そうだよ。
お連れの方たちハンバーグですかね、やっぱり。
ハンバーグ？
つまりですね、いいですか？彼女は日本人に見えるかもしれませんが、育ちはアメリカです。日本語は全く喋れません。僕らは確かに外見と言葉のギャップがあります。でももう21世紀、外見とアイデンティティは違うということを我々現代人は認めるべきです。
そうだ。
その通りだ。
うん。
Okay, so as I was saying, this is outright dangerous because it's racial profiling. Y'all heard that, so I'm not going to repeat it. But I do have students of Nepal who are of Nepali origin, Pakistani origin, Sri Lankan origin, Japanese origin. But the Japanese origin, I am racial profiling here. But I do have a Vietnamese Indian student right now. And it would be wrong of me to assume the ones who are all similar looking phenotype wise, brown, that they all have the same the same heritage, cultural heritage, just because they all look similar. And that if I do that, I'm inadvertently excluding many students because I'm expecting a certain basic cultural heritage. So when we talk about heritage language learner, we need to put the language back into it. And this is extremely important in less commonly taught languages. We are assuming it's not all brown students are from India or from the subcontinent. They might be from the diaspora. By the same token, not all brown students know Hindi. By the same token, not all non-brown students do not know Hindi. Some may know Hindi, some may have a background in it. So I have to be mindful and aware of that. Okay, so let's start reinstating that language every time we talk about a heritage language student or a heritage language learner. The third aspect of inclusion unique to language pedagogy is the multilingual student. This aspect, I think the multilingual student, according to me, is extremely important and is one who has either been largely ignored in our language classroom or has been dismissed, and only recently have we started to acknowledge their presence. Basically, the reason why this has happened is, why is it important? Because of multilingual translanguaging in the classroom, which for the longest time was a no-no. It was something that we would say is disturbing, it's a nuisance, it's a hindrance in the language classroom. That's how we have been treating that particular identity, the multilingual identity, the linguistic identity. The reason why we've been doing that is because we are following a tradition theory that has forced us to think of languages as discrete. We're learning L1, L2, L3. Slowly, that is changing with more emphasis on bilingualism in the US, but it's not changing fast enough. The theories that we have been engaging in so far have been coming out of the monolingual tradition. This is very important to understand. The assumptions of a monolingual tradition is shared speech, grammar, deviations are frowned upon, and proficiency. And that's what we've been working on. It's coming from the Western tradition. However, in multilingual societies, reality is very different. It's shared space that is important. There are multiple languages. When you walk out of a door, you do not know. When I was growing up, I walked out of my door. I did not know whether the next person, and I grew up in a big city, so lots of languages, whether the next person is going to speak, I didn't know which language they're going to speak. So I was ready for anything. I get into a cab, I do not know whether that cab driver is going to speak the same language as I am comfortable with. So there's a huge difference in the assumptions of communication. So what are my communicative practices? I was ready for anything, and I actually would try and meet the person in between. We would basically go and get whatever we need to communicate from our brains, from our actions. Deviations were the norm. It wasn't important that I actually said it in one language, because I didn't think of it as one language. It was repertoire building that was important, not being proficient. Who cares if my Marathi was not so good? As long as I had enough Marathi to communicate, that person understood me. Who cares if the other person's Hindi was not as good? So that is the difference. And once we realize that, it opens a whole new door into our pedagogy. What it tells us is the difference between name languages and linguistic system of the individual. In multilingual societies, you're thinking about the linguistic system of the individual, the bits and pieces of various name languages. When I say Hindi, Marathi, Spanish, French, Portuguese, I am talking about a named language, but my brain is not thinking Hindi, Marathi, Spanish, Portuguese, French. My brain has bits and pieces of these named languages, and it pulls out whatever needs to be effective. And we have been forcing our multilingual students, telling them that is wrong. And by that, we're not only doing them a disservice, guess whom we're doing a disservice for? Our monolingual students, because we are not giving them the tools they need to survive in the world. We're training them one language at a time. They're basically, let's recognize a monolingual student is becoming a multilingual student the minute they step into our classroom. They are on their journey to becoming multilingual. They need to know the tools, how to navigate spaces. So that, I think, is very crucial, and that we only experience in our language classroom. We have to give them those tools. So instead of frowning upon, translanguaging is a naturally occurring phenomena for multilingual students. Let's make all our students multilingual, proficient in dealing with a multilingual world. That's what we should aim for, not for separating out the name languages, because that's artificial. That, I think, is extremely important. This is another clip. Hopefully it will work well this time.
It is cheese, tomato, eat it. So, where are you from? Pakistan, eh?
I'm from Rajouri, India.
Ah, namaste.
Namaste.
Maybe Hindi.
आपको हिंदी आती है?
Un petit peu. How you say, I am mix Hindi, French, Spanish. Mary, mama, French, Spanish. Papa, Hindi.
आपके डैडी इंडियन है?
Oui, mama meet Papa Goa and boom boom. ले आ गई.
So they're translanguaging. They're trying to get them to communicate. They couldn't care less if one knows more French, one knows English. They were not. This is what happens in the real world. Oops. Basically, the linguistic repertoire of the multilingual student is what's important. Languages are part of a repertoire that is accessed for communicative purposes. Languages are not discrete and separated, but form an integrated system for each person who's using it. All students are in the process of becoming multilingual, as I mentioned that earlier. Oops. There we go. Another example. Short.
How long are we gonna wait this time?
Maybe she got stuck in traffic.
¿Tú sabes que Maribel walks home from work?
English or Spanish, one or the other.
And by saying that to our students constantly, we are doing them a disservice, because what they are going to see in life is this when they go out into the real world.
दूध है wonderful, पी सकते हैं रोज ग्लास फुल दूध 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 गर्मी में डालो दूध में आइस दूध बन गया very nice पियो daily once or twice मिल जाएगा tasty surprise दूध 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 drink wonderful दूध.
You get the idea. This is a real live ad, and I'm sure it happens in a lot of the cultures related to the languages we teach. Then the ads are no longer, movies are no longer just more, well, they've never been monolingual. They mix. You send a student out believing they only have to talk in Hindi. They come back and say, no one could understand me because I'm using these artificial words. So it's important to make them. I'll move on just in the interest of time. Code switching and code mixing are only one part. Translanguaging is the other part, which we need to understand to be inclusive. And this is kind of a color representation of how that thing is the name language is what we are seeing from outside. What is actually happening is that mixture in the middle, the meshing of languages. Why is this important? Because once we start acknowledging translanguaging is a natural phenomena for anyone who knows more than one named language. We start treating our students as users, not learners. I am trying to get my students to use Hindi, not learn Hindi. And once I start that, my pedagogy completely changes. Pedagogy is still the focus. Getting them to use Hindi is still the focus. But my approach is completely different. That would be a whole other talk. And assessment strategies are different now because I'm concentrating on them using Hindi, not learning bits and pieces of Hindi. The last aspect that I have identified is the subject matter, which is, again, I think unique to us in world language pedagogy. Why? Because the world is our subject matter. Who has told us that we only have to teach family, festivals, etc., food? Who has told us that? If we put all what I've said together, what we want is people to think, use the language that we are teaching in their thought process, to express their thoughts as much as they can, to communicate with people who have a similar repertoire of that language with them. Topics are open. So we're teaching at the university, let's have relevant topics, difficult topics. For example, in my first year Hindi class, I talk about caste. We just finished something on colorism, sustainability. You do not need to have very complex language. But this is what keeps our university students engaged. So why not? They've learned a lot of body parts, not because I've taught them body parts, or a lot about family, not because I've taught them. We've talked about these topics and they come up naturally when you talk about these topics. I'm going to show you also, basically this, I think the subject matter, yes, in some other subjects, they could bring in examples from anywhere, but in some subjects, they're very limited. When you're teaching chemistry, You can't really, maybe you can if you're creative enough, but we are not limited. So let us expand. Let us use whatever we think is going to keep them interested, focused, and become users of our language. And I'm going to end by sharing a few examples of impact of some of the aspects I have talked about, which I think are inclusive to world language pedagogy. The impact of inclusive language intervention. I told you I came up with this non-binary verb conjugation, and these are two, I'm just reporting two of the reactions. One was a verbal request by a student who identifies non-binary, and it broke my heart, that request. The student said, if it does not create problems for other students, I would like to use non-binary verb conjugations if possible, even if they are not yet part of Hindi. It broke my heart because imagine going through life thinking you're creating problems for others because you are opting to do something which may not yet be part of the language. And the student, I said, sure, go ahead. I will include it, and everyone knows it's not part of Hindi, but you need to feel safe and okay in the space. And the second one was, you all can read, it says, I felt the class was really welcoming, and I can't describe enough how much I truly appreciate inclusion of so many inclusive options, including non-binary, and I have covered that, so I have no idea what it says anymore. What about the impact of the inclusive subject matter? The last point, I said the world is our subject. You choose what excites you, and that will excite the students. From spring 2022 course evaluation, the student said, I enjoyed working on the caste system, and this is the first year student, as it was also. So this is not, I'm not talking about third year and beyond. I'm talking, you can have what I hate the difference between content courses and non, you can have content right from the beginning. I enjoyed working on the caste system as it was also teaching more in depth about culture and provided a vocabulary that was bigger than classroom discussions. Dalit is what was formerly called untouchable caste in India. We have a caste system there, which still exists. And a student from first year Hindi, second semester, being a Dalit, my grandfather had to endure many indignities. Discussing the caste system in class made me feel I belonged. So it's important for us to start incorporating these difficult dialogues. And this is one of my favorites, the impact of creating space for both translanguaging and inclusive subject matter, both of them. The one which is in the box is the only part that was written in English, and it is English. The rest was all in Hindi. Of course, I've translated it for this particular talk. I'm going to read it out because I don't know if it's big enough for everyone to read. What is beauty? It was this was written Sundarta Kya Hai by Vandana George, and I got her permission in first year Hindi. What is beauty? For a 6-year-old girl child, those Barbies that are kept in the shop, their fair faces, blonde hair, blue eyes, that song she had heard, a nursery rhyme in English. Curly hair, very fair, eyes are blue, lovely too. She wants that Barbie who's different from her, that Barbie who's prettier than her, that Barbie who's different from her, prettier than her. I was that child. Have you noticed? Only fair children are called beautiful. Quiet. A 10-year-old child is now learning. TV is teaching her. There are so many creams. There are so many soaps. There is so much makeup, all to become fair. The dark-skinned woman is now fair. The sad woman is now happy. That 10-year-old child, is she aware? Does she know that she's like the dark-skinned woman? Does she know that she will not become fair? Is she aware that she has to become beautiful? That she will have to become sad? No, that child is me. I am intelligent. I know that TV is wrong. Quiet. A young woman has learned. I am learning that TV is wrong, that society is wrong, that the internet is wrong, that friends are wrong, that the people who put makeup at 5 a.m. are wrong, that the people who wear a sweater in summer, they are the ones who are wrong, that people who wear wigs, they are wrong, that the people who buy a beautiful Barbie, they are the ones who are wrong. Yes, all are wrong, because when they are not wrong, I am not beautiful. And this was a product. The student wrote, it's a beautiful poem in Hindi. The only part was curly hair, but that was translanguaging in writing. She needed to write that. It was a product after we did colorism in our first year class. So with that, I think I would like to basically end by saying we can have such a rickety bridge if we continue with our own practices and are not mindful. But if you're mindful about the few aspects that are really, really exclusive to language pedagogy, we might be able to have a nice, strong bridge and get our users across that. So, thank you.
I don't know if they'll hear me, but if anyone has questions, please feel free to ask in chat or unmute yourself and ask them live.
Any questions? I'm repeating what Betsy says. Please feel free to unmute yourselves or yeah, take it live.
Hi, this is Fernanda. I would like to ask a question. I know we're running out of time. I work for the Center for Foreign Languages. It's government. I'm the deputy director there. We have language training in all kinds of language you can imagine, and we mostly train diplomats, right? It's different than undergraduate students. But very interesting. Thanks for the presentation. I just wanted to ask a question related to how do you think we could prepare teachers to have those difficult discussions, you know, with learners? Because sometimes when we try to be inclusive, there's always this question, like in some of the examples you mentioned, like, oh, we can adjust the language, even though the language doesn't work that way yet, or things like that. And in our context, we're preparing people to live abroad, right? And there is always this contradiction, right? Oh, but I'm using something in the classroom that might not be applicable outside. So how to reconcile that type of tension, I guess?
Yeah, that is a tough question. Good question.
so sorry.
No. So how do you train teachers, right?
To
make
how
the
to
classroom,
prepare them, yeah.
How to prepare the teachers. The teachers are taking people abroad, is that it? Or for
Yes.
teachers to have difficult conversations in classrooms? I kind of
yeah,
tuned out.
the teachers have, the training takes place in Canada, right? And the teachers are in Canada. They're not from Canada, obviously. They're native speakers, but the employees are diplomats, right? Canadian diplomats, and they're going abroad, right? To leave the reality of the language abroad.
Right. So I would basically start with opening up and being self-reflective and share stories. And once you start sharing stories, you get them to start sharing stories. And then they suddenly start realizing that, okay, this is the way. So these are it's teacher training program. Did I get that right? Is it a teacher training program, Fernanda?
No, it's not a teacher training program. We have the teachers. They teach all kinds of foreign language. But I was just thinking, like, how to prepare or better equip those teachers, right?
Okay, I got it now. Sorry, I wasn't sure whether okay, so how to prepare? By basically having workshops for them on inclusive pedagogy and how to make language programs more inclusive, by tuning them, because I had a little kind of learning community here with colleagues, and it was an eye-opener for many colleagues. It was first like, no, we can't do that because that is not part of our language. Or no, when they go to XYZ country, it's going to be frowned upon. But when you went deeper into it and they started realizing that this has happened for a long time, language intervention, or not only language, it doesn't always have to be language intervention, sensitivity. So sensitivity training for teachers, sensitivity workshops for teachers. Now we suddenly have a cohort of all language, not all, but those who participated, who are much more attuned to having self-reflection, which translates into pedagogy, which translates into understanding who's sitting in front of them. They started becoming a little more. So basically, I would say go the route of having workshops for your teachers. That is the route I would suggest. If anyone else has any other suggestion, but that seems to have worked. We are doing a summer training program also, in which, again, we have a substantial portion where we're talking about issues that come up in language classes and how teachers should approach it. If a topic comes up on racism, how should a teacher approach it? Should the teacher just talk about what's in the textbook, or should the teacher create spaces and say, okay, this is a safe space, everyone can have their own views as long as we're respectful? So basically training workshops, and that seems to be working.
Yeah, no, that's great. We're going towards that direction because I feel like I was a teacher myself before, and I don't think it's fair to expect the teachers to be comfortable or ready to have those discussions necessarily, depending when you graduated or when you finished and you started teaching. And depending where you graduated, as I said, our teachers have a different background as well, right? They come from elsewhere. We can just not expect those things to happen
you cannot
organically.
You cannot, but you'll be surprised. We had a colleague who is no longer with us, had come from India, and it was all very alien for that colleague to be very inclusive, because that was just not the pedagogy there. But the colleague was slowly learning, and guess what? They learn from their students. They start learning that certain things are acceptable and not acceptable. So if you have a workshop to get them ready for that, they would appreciate it very much. That, okay, I realize that I'm in a different environment, I'm teaching in a different setting. That's very important.
Yeah, well, thanks so much.
I think that's it.
I can ask a very quick
Sure.
one. I would just love to hear more about the maybe not workshop, but the group that you had with other instructors and how that was set up, what kinds of conversations you had.
So this was actually, I got from our teaching and learning center. I got a language learning community grant, not language, a learning community grant. And this was within our department, Department of Asian Studies, but it was open to everyone, but it was about language classrooms. And basically an open call. I got about 6, we didn't want it to be too big. So I think when it was 6 or 7 of us, anyone was welcome, but we landed up being 6 or 7. And we would meet every 2 weeks and discuss. So first, well, we talked about what being inclusive really means. And then we started reading texts. We started discussing what's happening in our classrooms, realizing some things are very similar, some things are not at all similar. Got a few students to present as well on things like that sensitized us, things like imposter syndrome and things which were identity. There was a lot of resistance by a couple of people about identity. Towards the end, they were like, okay, I now get what you're talking about. So it was bi-weekly meetings discussing the various aspects. And during that, I started putting these aspects because we were talking about different things that came up in our classrooms. And I was like, yeah, we don't really think about this, or we should be thinking. So it was basically a pure networking. Yeah,
thank you. Sure.
You're welcome. And I think the more we do that in our language little groups and cross languages, they were all from different languages. There's so much to learn. There's so much. Well, I think,
Any other comments or questions?
well, thank you so much
Thank you.
for
Thank you
indulging
very
me.
much.
It was just putting everything we all know together. So thank you for indulging me.